ENVRAL Studies Paper 1 Topic. Indian culture will cover the salient aspects of art forms, literature and architecture from ancient to modern times. Q. Revivalism and reformism were natural corollaries to the newly emerging idea of nationalism in colonial India. Discuss 250 words. Background. In the 19th century, the idea of national identity emerged from literature, and most Indian writings turned into the voice of enlightenment. This paved the way for India to understand the real, factual position of nationalism by the time it reached the threshold of the 20th century. How both revivalism and reformism are natural corollaries of the emerging idea of nationalism. By the end of the 19th century, revivalists were dominant, and their aim was not to oppose the advancement initiated by reformists, but to create changes in Hindu society, changes as radical as those of social reformers but based in Indian ideals. In the early 20th century, a clear-cut distinction could be made between the major revivalist movements and social reform movements in terms of objectives that they both set for Indian society's advancement. But both revivalists and reformers had reached an essential accord on social questions. Similarity of views was present too. Both the groups, despite the sharpest of surface disagreements, the only real dispute between reformers and revivalists was over the authorities from which they derived their inspiration. The reformist movements responded with the time and scientific temper of the modern era. The revivalist movements believed that the Western thinking and missionary propaganda would ruin Indian culture and ethos, and thus there was a need to protect the religion. They were also influenced by the rich cultural heritage of India brought to light by the Western scholars. Both these movements wanted to change the status quo in the society wherein several deformities had crept in. All of them, in some way or other, attack on inhuman practices such as sati, female infanticide, child marriage, etc., along with superstitions, complex rituals, and so on. The reformers attempted to improve the status of girls and women in society. They all emphasized the need for female education. The reform movements fostered feelings of self-respect, self-reliance, and patriotism among the Indians, while the reformist movements strived to change the fundamental system and structures of the society through gradual changes within the existing institutions. The revivalist movements tended to revive former customs or practices and thus take the society back to the glorious past. Literature's role. Patriotic writings proliferated almost spontaneously in different languages, as the resistance of a community against foreign rule. Frank Gadigal in Bengali, Mirza Ghalib in Urdu, and Britandu Harish Chandra in Hindi expressed themselves as the patriotic voice of that era. This voice was on the one hand was against colonial rule and on the other for the glorification of India. The birth of the novel is associated with the social reform-oriented movement of the 19th century. This new genre, borrowed from the West, is characterized by a spirit of revolt, right from its adoption into the Indian system. 9. www.insightsinIndia.com Secure synopsis. Many novels like Pratap Mudaliar from 1879, Sri Rangarajachara from 1872, etc. were written with didactic intentions and to re-examine evil social customs and practices like untouchability, caste distinctions, denial of remarriage of widows, etc. Conclusion. It is true that the idea of a modern state took root in Indian society because of India's contact with Western ideas, but Indian writers like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and others made use of this newly acquired concept of nationalism to attack colonial rule, and in the process, created their own brand of nationalism, rooted in the soil. This shows both revivalism and reformism were natural corollaries. Q. Unlike the Dark Middle Ages of Europe, India's Middle Ages brought about a very rich tradition of devotional literature and poetry which dispels its assumption of a dark period of India's history. Comment. 250 words. Background. India in Dark Ages was not different from the rest of the world in the sense that continuous rise and fall of empires and constant battles were omnipresent during that period. But the development India made in fields of religion, philosophy, literature, science, administration, etc. are the reasons that this period in Indian history is aptly called medieval period and not the Dark Ages. Medieval India is also witness to Bhakti and Sufi movements. These were revolutionary religious movements which preached communal brotherhood, salvation through devotion, equality of mankind, shunning superstition, to name a few. Middle Ages brought about a very rich tradition of devotional literature and poetry. Indian literature, which had survived through medieval times, has had their revival. Jaineshwari, Tukaram, Ravis, Rabai, Kabir, Tulsidas, Surdas and host of others spearheaded the movement for revival. The South had their strong stalwarts in Kannadigas, Tyagaraja and Subrahmanya in Marathi. The movement of revival received impetus through translations of the classics. Love poetry, the dominating note in Bhakti is ecstasy and total identity with God. It is a poetic approach to religion and an ascetic approach to poetry. It is poetry of connections, connecting the worldly with the divine, and as a result, the old form of secular love poetry began to have a new meaning in all languages. Bhakti also attacked the age-old caste system and devoted itself to the worship of humanity, because the catchword of Bhakti is that God is there in every human being. The movement was in essence subaltern, as most of its poets belonged to the so-called lower castes. The rise of Bhakti poetry gave rise to regional languages based on the conception of Bhakti did away with the elite tradition of Sanskrit and accepted the more acceptable language of the common man. The power of ancient Bhakti poetry in Tamil set in motion what might well be considered a pan-Indian efflorescence. After Tamil, Pampa's great court epics were composed in Kannada in the 10th century. Devotional literature in Kannada, the Vadhana sayings of the various saints of the Krishna, Rama and Shiva books, is well known. Basavan was a famous Kannada poet. Alamarprathu Kannada wrote great poetry under the guard of religion. Marathi, Gyanswar is the first and foremost Bhakti poet in Marathi. He became famous for his poetic contribution to Bhakti for Vishnu. 10. www.insightsinIndia.com secure synopsis. Bennett wrote his short poetic narratives and devotional and had as a literary form, and after him it was Tukaram whose songs cast a spell all over Maharashtra. Gujarati poets like Narsimha and Premananda occupy a prominent place in the galaxy of the Vaishnava poets. Bengali, Chandidas, a Bengali poet, is acclaimed as a great genius for the lucidity and sweetness of his poems. Sri Caitanya, a great Bengali saint, helped Vaishnavism to turn into a religious and literary movement, made it a living faith and became the source of never-ending inspiration to a host of Bengali poets, including Jiva Goswami. Medieval Muslim Bengali poets like Boylat Kazi and Syed Al-Adol wrote narrative poems based on Sufistic philosophy, betraying a happy cultural and religious synthesis of Islam and Hinduism. In fact, Bhakti became a great platform for Hindu-Muslim unity. Similarly, Vidyapati in Maithili created a new poetic language. Lded, a Kashmiri Muslim poetess, gave a new dimension to mystical Bhakti. In fact, epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata received a rebirth in the new languages. These languages gave a fresh life, a renewed relevance, and a meaningful reincarnation to the great Sanskrit epics, and these epics in their turn provided substance and style to the new languages too. Women poets of Bhakti, the all-war women poets like Handel and others, gave expression to their love for the divine. They all wrote small lyrics or poems of devotional fervor, metaphysical depth, and with a spirit of dedication and utmost sincerity. Behind their mysticism and metaphysics is a divine sadness. Other trends in medieval literature. Bhakti was not the only aspect of medieval literature. Love ballads and heroic poetry in Punjabi, known as Kissa and War, were popular Punjabi medieval forms. During the medieval period, Urdu, as a language, came into being. Then, it was Dar and Mir Taki Mir who gave Urdu maturity and class, and ushered it into the modern period.